Why did you decide to have the Nine Muses be the focus of our conversation?
So the muses speak to me very, very loudly and clearly. First of all, I'm a career teacher of science. Things like mathematics, like calculus, for example, and these things in our culture, probably because of the kinship with technology, are thought of as like almost the antithesis of creativity. So when I talk about muses, you think of music, and you think of something that is completely spontaneous and ineffable. I don't know why I'm producing these improvised melodies. It's just sort of coming out of me, as opposed to something like astronomy or history, which are stereotyped in our world as uncreative. A very passionate thing for me is to have people understand that the study of mathematics once was an extremely mystical, magical, and artistic pursuit, deeply connected to the human sense of beauty and also the harmony of nature. When you humbly ask nature, what are you made of? The answer more and more and more is this absolutely gorgeous and intricate mathematical framework.
I love chilling out here at the Myth Slayer Café because some incredible people drop by and we have some great conversations. Today, that conversation is going to be with Henry Kandel. Henry, thank you for stopping by the cafe. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
I'm a yogi. I've been practicing many forms of yoga for about 30 years. I also, function in the world karmically as a science teacher. But I am, and the past few years, I have considered psychedelics to be the missing puzzle piece of my yoga practice. So a series of experiences going back several years, some of them very subtle, some very profound, have sort of brought me into a much deeper relationship with my yoga and all of the things in my life that spin out from that.
And some of those who might be hanging out with us in the cafe might be wondering what that has to do with leadership. Well, you're going to find out, but let me just start off by confirming some of the work that you do actually has a relationship to leadership, and there very much is a connection in your eyes. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So yoga, when I say yoga, just to preempt a possible misunderstanding, I'm not talking exclusively or even mainly about the stretchy postures that people think of when they think of the word yoga. I'm talking about breath practices. I'm talking about, shapes of the hand that are endowed with some very strong intention. And this is relevant for, you could say the purpose of yoga is to unite body, energy, which is sometimes translated as speech, and mind. So I take it for granted that any enterprise in the world, whether it's teaching astronomy to college-bound seniors or leading any kind of human enterprise, benefits from the breath being balanced, the body being kind of owned, and the mind being relatively peaceful and cohesive. So really, the enterprise of yoga can be brought to bear for any human enterprise, but especially something complex and human, like leading people, will benefit from these kinds of practices. It's no coincidence that a lot of these psychedelic ceremonies that are also incorporating the somatic practices of yoga and other types of practices are being utilized for this type of thing. The last ayahuasca retreat I was on, it was a notable portion of the people there participating, dealing with very, very, profound, often life struggles. But the main purpose for their attendance and working on themselves this way was to be able to deal with those things, to unleash their full creative capacity. And often it was for some job that was relatively, like one doctor I met leads a branch of the World Health Organization at a recent retreat. So so this man is trying to unblock, and that is the language we find it in yoga and often in these indigenous traditions that undergird things like the ayahuasca ceremony, is the idea that we carry blockages And those blockages fundamentally impede our energy. And that energy may go into loving relationships with other people, but it can also go into us flourishing in our professional context, whatever that may be.
Really, really helpful. Thank you for making that connection clear. Before we step into the mythological figure that is centering this conversation, let me just make sure, for the purposes of clarity, I know that many who might be listening to this are lawyers or other professionals that may work in environments that are more conservative, or they may come from backgrounds that are extraordinarily traditional, or that are not necessarily familiar with the world of psychedelics. This can be very surprising and unusual for them to hear as having a leadership connection, being relevant to leadership. We'll talk about that a lot more later. But before we go into the discussion about that, you used a term that I just want to make sure everyone understands, and that is ayahuasca. Can you explain what ayahuasca is for anyone who might be ignorant about that substance?
Oh yeah, thank you, Scott. Okay, yeah. So, and I'll try to address also the wider context too. So, ayahuasca is a blend of plants that was discovered in the rainforests of South America, and one of the plants contains DMT, which is a powerful psychedelic. And this is I will talk about this more generally in a very science-friendly way. And so, just as an aside, yoga is often seen as a mind-body technology. So rather than some kind of compendium of esoteric practices that you mentioned, people who are sort of more, living in the world, perhaps have a more of a science friendly mentality. And in my psychedelic yoga practice, I will be able to give very reasonable explanations of everything in terms that are friendly to science. I'll give an example of what that might be. So ayahuasca particularly combines DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic, with another plant that basically impedes the body's normal breakdown of DMT, so that it lasts in the body for longer and is bioavailable in different ways. So that a DMT experience, for example, smoked, might last for literally 30 seconds. The second plant in the ayahuasca brew allows that chemical to persist in the body for hours. So a person in an ayahuasca ceremony is experiencing this profound altered state for hours upon hours. So just to address your very excellent, wider context, and give a sort of really nutshell science friendly explanation of psychedelics and yoga. And an example of psychedelic yoga would be, so this altered state provides you with an enhanced learning opportunity. So the idea is very, very easy to understand. If you ever watch children learn, children are generally, if they're taught in the right way, don't have a strong aversion to failure. They're not constantly trying to put things into sort of linguistic understandings to prevent failure. They run into things with much more exploration and creativity, and they learn much faster. So the idea of a psychedelic experience in the context of learning to grow leadership capacities, or relational capacities, or deal with personal trauma, pain, or whatever the purpose is to induce a state of increased learning capacity by basically making the person temporarily more like their child self. So, and then yoga, so as a mind-body technology comes in, because, for example, let's say you want to cultivate a more confident presence, which is a pretty general thing, which is going to benefit people operating in basically any sphere of life. So there are yoga asanas. These are the postural aspects of yoga that really embody these qualities. Like if I stand in so-called mountain pose, it's a standing posture, and I'm seated right now, but basically I have my upper body doing it. The shoulders are very relaxed and they're sinking down the back. I have the back of my neck is elongated, and all these things are things that can be built with practice. My chin is very gently tucked to elongate the back of the head, and the posture is improved, and the breathing capacity is improved. And regardless of what my ego will allow me to do with my mind in those moments, I'm holding that posture. I can feel the confidence sinking into my body. It's like you simply take this posture, and with that posture comes confidence. If that's done in the context of psychedelic work, then the person has an opportunity to learn this physicalization, this deep internalizing of confidence at a much deeper level, as if they were a kindergartner again learning it for the first time.
As you mentioned earlier, when kids step into that learning space, they embrace it with a sense of curiosity, but you also mentioned the word creativity. And that leads us to the subject, the mythical subject of our discussion today, the Nine Muses. 9 goddesses closely associated with the arts, with science, and everything else involving inspiration. Why did you, when agreeing to appear on this show, decide to have the 9 Muses be the focus of our conversation? Who are they? And why do they speak to you?
Yes. Okay. So the muses speak to me very, very loudly and clearly. When you proposed this meeting, I thought, oh, there are a lot of possibilities because a lot of these myths speak to me. But the muses are a really obvious one because, well, first of all, I'm a career teacher of science. And one of the things at a very creative school, and I have tried through my career to infuse the teaching of things like mathematics, like I've taught calculus, for example, and these things in our culture, probably because of the kinship with technology, are thought of as like almost the antithesis of creativity, almost the antithesis. So if I talk about muses, you think of music, and you think of something that is completely spontaneous and ineffable. I don't know why I'm producing these improvised melodies. It's just sort of coming out of me, as opposed to something like astronomy or history, which are also represented by muses, which are stereotyped in our world for whatever combination of reasons as uncreative endeavors. So that's a very passionate thing for me, is like to have people understand that the study of mathematics once was, back in Pythagorean times, was an extremely mystical, magical, and artistic pursuit. I mean, the Pythagoreans thought of music as something which was obviously deeply connected to the human sense of beauty and also the harmony of nature. They thought that these kinds of principles would be found to be the principles of nature. And more or less in carrying out the program of physics over the centuries, that has been what has been discovered. As opposed to, sort of like we say as a bias, the world must be made of math, and then we have a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, no. When you humbly ask nature, what are you made of? The answer more and more and more is this absolutely gorgeous and intricate mathematical framework. So that's one reason. Okay. But I also want to say about the muses. So it connects to me in such multiple ways, because the muses are these 9 goddesses, in some traditions 3, in some traditions 9. It's also a tradition with a lot of diversity in a lot of different, the stories are told in very different ways. But these 9 muses that represent, things like dance, things like instrumental music, lyric poetry, and things like history and astronomy. And I also want to note that astronomy was considered by Ptolemy in ancient times the consummation of mathematics. So the idea that the intellectual disciplines were as rigidly separated as they are today is not a thing, and really probably should be questioned. But these 9 goddesses result from the union of Zeus and the goddess of memory.
Yeah.
The goddess of memory. So then you're thinking, okay, well, what's that about? And you realize that all of these things like poetry and all of these studies, the movement of the body, for example, go back to these distant history where memory, we could not write things down for centuries and centuries, millennia. Things could not be recorded. So really the study of sort of like emotional arousal through the arts and through dance and through things like that was deeply entwined with memory. If you're a child in my tribe, the reason I'm teaching you this particular type of ritual dance, the reason that I'm singing to you from a very young age is to instill in deep memory these things that it is very important for you to know as a member of our tribe. at a time way before, let alone the computer, the book. So these things become entwined with our motivational system. So when you sing to a young child, you'll find not only the parts of the brain activated that lead to ultimately memory and remembering the words and starting to assess a fundamental importance on language and language learning, but also the motivational system. So we have in this reveal, that this is Zeus and the goddess of memory who produced these muses, this beautiful understanding that these things are all connected, our power, our energy, and also memory. And that when we learn, we are fundamentally working with our memories.
From a leadership perspective, one thing that anyone who has managed people for any amount of time, I should say, who has managed them successfully will understand, and anyone who reads leadership literature at all, particularly any leadership literature that's been written within the past 30, 40 years or so, will understand that culture is absolutely fundamental to whether an organization is able to really create, but especially sustain success. If you want the top people, it is a cliche to say, to be hired by you and stay with you, especially now where information about corporate culture is easily available through websites and online and through chat groups and all that sort of stuff. You need to have created a positive culture, and you need to actually live that culture out. People who are the best performers generally do not sit and say, wow, I'm performing left and right. I am doing amazing outputs. Let me continue to be abused. They just don't do that. They will go to places where they feel like they are treated well. And so a lot of what goes into creating culture and understanding culture, if you look into the literature, is developing and documenting the institutional memory. Part of what creates a brand, part of what creates a corporate culture, and what a lot of leadership experts advise people to do is make sure that you're noting the milestones in your company. Who founded it? When was it founded? What struggles did they go through? Who came and contributed along the way? What were the quote unquote births and deaths of new products or new initiatives or things that succeeded or didn't? Maybe have a hall of fame in your building somewhere, or a memory book that goes into the employee welcome package. All of these things that are associated with creating memory, not just to have, but going back to the muses, to inspire. And so literally the idea of memorializing a positive company culture is combining the goddess of memory with the avatar of leadership, Zeus, to create inspiration, the nine muses for the employee. Now, how do things like breath work or these yoga practices that you're talking about from a scientific perspective, and you've hinted at this earlier, but let's go into more detail. How do these directly relate to supporting the company culture, not just as a touchy-feely, warm and fuzzy sort of thing, but from a hardcore data perspective, particularly vis-a-vis inspiration? Because really, only the most foolish of leaders thinks that they're going to have positive employee outputs if the staff is too demotivated to function, if they're not inspired.
First, before I get scientific about it, let me talk about another story about the muses. Is that before Zeus and the goddess of memory, we have a union of Uranus and Gaia, Earth and the heavens, and that this is an even older origin of the muses. And I think for me, that speaks to body groundedness and mind imagination. Is a union between sort of the ultimate in rootedness, groundedness, earthiness, practicality. We have to eat, we have to survive, and the heavens, which are for most people in antiquity this realm of mystery that is marked by eternal nature. The star shapes go in perfect circles and never die. Perfect geometric manifestation, that is like circles, unlike anything we see on Earth, and no change. So a realm of eternity, and of and all kinds of things that spawns. So I would say that in order to make the most of understanding the connection between memory, say a memory of an institution, and the inspiration is the body, and the body that's represented perhaps by Gaia, and the mind, which is represented perhaps by Uranus, the imagination. And in terms of science, you will find it all over the place. So you will find, for example, studies in cognitive science or the science of education that show that motivation is completely connected with your capacity to learn. I mean, they're completely connected. So if you have some task that inspires you and motivates you, and you could put this in the language of neurochemicals, you could say, well, Scott's dopamine system is stoked by this particular thing, and you can then connect dopamine with memory. So, like for instance, with Parkinson's patients, they find that very simple tasks that engage the dopamine system, like drumming, like rhythmic engagement of the body's motor system, may actually improve their function and improve their memory. So everything's connected. The yogi knows this. So if you're trying to, for example, tell stories about the company, what were we like several generations ago? What was the inspiring vision of this particular person? That's in words. That's going to be captured and stored in words. But the effect of it on people that will then become their motivation, that creates the next round of creativity, that's physical. It's physical.
Mm-hmm.
People are telling themselves stories. This is the frustration of a modern yogi, is because you see it so pervasive. We have separated. If the goal of the yogi is to unite body and mind, the culture often presents it like there are the thoughts up here that are what you are. So that's the frustration of somebody working within a certain paradigm. They say, well, we have these stories that everyone's telling, and we're all supposed to believe this, but I can tell that the manager or the leader doesn't believe it. And if you were to ask what basis is that for that disbelief, or the failure for a genuinely inspiring story to actually bring about inspiration in people, is physical. It's on the breath. It's deeply in what we call in yoga, and with no esoteric meaning, just the chakras, where you actually feel yourself, your motivation, your pain, your emotional pain, your sense of flow. It's in the physical body.
It's interesting. What you're pointing to is something that people say about organizational leaders, team leaders, leaders of any sort all the time, but that can be easy to forget when you are actually in that position, which is that those who are in your charge when you're a leader are watching every single thing that you do, and they either mirror it or they critique it. And you are right. How many times have any of us worked for an organization, and you have seen, to some extent through actions, but to some extent almost on an instinctive level, that the leader that you are working for doesn't truly buy into what they're talking about? And you are providing an explanation of that, as well as a reminder that if you're a leader and you're touting the company line, or if you are saying all of these words that are because of your MBA, things that you know that you're supposed to say, or that because you have read, the most recent issue of Harvard Business Review, and that is what they say the current thinking around what good leadership is. If you're not really feeling it, if it's not internalized almost on a cellular level, then the more perceptive members of your staff, really probably all of your staff, will note it and either diminish you or act according to how they perceive you to really be, as opposed to what you're saying. Interestingly enough, the Muses were known for their songs and their performances that conveyed all of this history. And so you mentioned offhand something about, presenting in a way that's confident, or standing in front of a group and making sure that you are delivering whatever your message is in a way that reflects leadership as well. Now, we haven't yet on this show, except with one episode involving a man named George 𝗏 as the guest, gone into a lot of detail about the relationship of public presentation and things like charisma to leadership. But what you're pointing at is really outside of even the mechanics of public presentation, which if you're interested in that subject, go to George 𝗏's episode. It's excellent. And he goes into a lot of depth about that. You're talking about really almost a deeper, more comprehensive, and I would even say beyond performative approach to your physicality as a leader. Am I understanding you correctly?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I would say an analogy in the arts is method acting. The actor wants to find some way, you said on a cellular level, the actor wants to find some way to embrace this fiction, whatever the role is, that is true on a cellular level. Because to make the analogy, and it's really a pretty tight one, in that case, the audience member, the person may be uttering the lines. They're uttering the lines that are in the script. But if they're uttering lines showing and maybe this is the director's choice is done, but like if it's supposed to be a depiction of a confident character, and the person the posture reveals not a confident posture, and the voice is tense and seized, and even if you're saying what is you were taught is the right language in your MBA program, or you're saying the right lines in the script as an actor, it's not going to work for 2 seconds, because that's not how humans really communicate. And the muses are wonderful, and a lot of the way you're working is very, very skillful. And I would say that it is scientifically justifiable, and you find evidence in cognitive science all over the place that we are built as social primates we're built for social interaction. So, for example, this internal family systems, these modern therapies that basically take, what in yoga you would call imbalances in the chakras, or in another language you would call emotional pain. If you can see these things in terms of people, parts of yourself, parts of your own psyche, or a muse to say like, okay, my relationship with history is going to be through this being, then you have something very close to a technique that has been used in many, many, many yogas for millennia, which is you take, like my Tibetan teachers, for example, they don't necessarily believe in the physical existence of this particular deity that represents compassion. But they realize, without necessarily an explicit scientific understanding, they realize that generating compassion within themselves is going to be easier if there's a visualized being that's somebody they love. So that's what I would say, is that if you take the whole muse thing, you say, like, I don't actually believe in these 9 beings as physically incarnate beings, but I realize that by taking my relationship with art, or relationship with my own creativity, or science, or anything, and embody it that way, that it will be effective.
Yeah, the whole idea of embodiment plays out in my own practice as an aside by encouraging clients to identify an Olympian figure that, or a god of another sort, or maybe an extraordinarily heroic figure from Greek myths, and really begin to see that as the North Star that guides who and what they are. Why are they identifying with that figure? What about its characteristics speaks to them? What about the visual iconography associated with that figure may speak to their own personal characteristics, values, vision, a whole host of other things, the narrative arcs associated with that particular mythical individual. Does that relate to what they want their own personal and professional narrative to look like? Now, I have been accused of propagating false gods, and I have an avatar myself. I tell people, and I think I've raised it on the show before, and it's certainly on my website, my avatar is Helios, the sun god. I own that. And there are a lot of things about Helios from a story perspective, from a artistic perspective, from from a characteristic perspective that really speak to me and guide me. Do I actually believe that if I got into a rocket and went to the sun, I would see Helios there instead of a gigantic ball of gas? No, I do not believe that. I really do believe that that giant ball of gas would be what is there, and I likely would burn to a crisp. But nonetheless, exactly what you're saying. By picking an avatar, you are putting a physical embodiment in your mind to the characteristics that you're seeking to live out, and that then has more power than just sort of thinking through or grasping or attempting to integrate into your life abstract concepts like radiance, like shining light, or imparting knowledge on people, or promoting connection to values and to ethics. All of those are conceptually very difficult for most people to latch onto. I also have to point out then, going back to some of the earlier parts of this conversation regarding psychedelics, you mentioned ayahuasca. It's not the only psychedelic in the world. That those are used and have historically been used by artists to inspire, and therefore they have a connection to the muses. But interestingly enough, leadership, although not traditionally defined as creative, to the extent you are, as we've talked about earlier today, charged with inspiring your staff, have to tap into your creativity. And so, do you see a connection between leadership and involvement in psychedelics as a growth mechanism, and art as a way to grow, bring something different into the world, and have inspiration expressed?
Absolutely. I would define art extremely broadly. I would define art as broadly as it takes to include mathematics and other things like that too. Just as a aside there, it's true that mostly, if you were looking at the context of psychedelic work going back centuries, you would say it's more creative because it's associated with things like music and dance. But the Fadiman studies before the war on drugs he was working with people with LSD that were mathematicians and architects and people working on problems that you would say are, you'd have to have a very broad definition of creativity to say and appreciate, say, the mathematician's creative mind. So really, it's a matter of inducing a state that is prior to this adult mind that we have, which is really, really locked down by language. I mean, so for example, a lot of these distinctions we're talking about, that this just seeing what the muses are associated with reveals, is that we have come to think of like astronomy as completely separate from mathematics. We're completely, physics is separate from chemistry, and these things are certainly separate from the humanities. So we have done this, and these are arbitrary distinctions. Just like we have names for our emotions that tend to, once we have them, they tend to limit the sort of way that we think we're capable of feeling. So a lot of times when people do psychedelic work, one of the obstacles is dealing with surges of energy that represent emotional energy that's undifferentiated. It's not as simple as I feel this anger at this person that did me wrong, or I feel this joy about this positive memory. It's just like we are energetic beings. So if a person's coming to me and says like, I want to succeed in leadership, it's not really relevant. I mean, I would say that probably it would not be optimal for their goals to be focused exclusively on their goals. The best focus for them is to say, let me take this, if you have a week to do it, usually serious psychedelic work, you're supposed to allow some time, but to just energetically get to know myself better. I mean, when I'm working with clients, and I say it only partly as a joke, that if I'm a yogi, so if I'm teaching you yoga, if I'm teaching you how to learn your body, your mind, and your energy in a different way, and we're using psychedelics to accelerate that process, it might be that you will discover things about yourself that mean that you're not in the job that you want to be in. I mean, you might, but sort of the sense of openness toward and real relationship with yourself as as a creative, and I would say even magical being, which is why your work resonates so much with mine, will empower anyone. So if that person is meant to step into that leadership role, and they do so with a little bit more embodiment, a little bit deeper and more resonant breath, a mind that's more, you could say focused. These are all metaphors, but that will benefit them, because as you're saying, people will know. I didn't directly answer the question about creativity, but if that was
But that's what the Myth Slayer is all about, just having a
yeah.
conversation, letting it go where it will go, and us having insight that comes from that. Again, using the spirit of creativity to build leaders worthy of Mount Olympus. Now, before we go any further, I have some additional exploration with regards to psychedelics that I want to take us into. But as we're discussing them, I do want to make it very clear right now a few things. A, I'm not endorsing any practices that are against the law, nor am I advocating that anyone do anything that is contrary to the advice of a doctor or a medical practitioner, nor am I endorsing doing anything without the knowledge or involvement of a medical practitioner or someone who is knowledgeable on the subject. So let me just get that out there so I don't have to hear about anything later regarding any supposed endorsement on my part. Number two, I also want to make sure that it's very clear to an audience member who may not be familiar with the world of psychedelics that we're not just talking about going to Central Park here in New York City, finding a nice tree to sit under and taking some mushrooms without any guidance and without any preparation and without any quality control over what it is that you're ingesting, and ending up in a situation. We're not talking about party drug usage. We're not talking about anything other than psychedelic experiences that are done with a specific intent and with from a trusted source, with an individual that is prepared and trained to facilitate, that has integration, and that helps you set an intent that is ultimately going to be constructive and leading into a place of that increased creativity and self-awareness that we're talking about. Now, with
Thank
that
you.
mouthful sputtered out, let's talk about the risks associated with going all in on your creativity as a leader. You mentioned it as something that could occur within a psychedelic context, but it might occur elsewhere too if you're engaging in any sort of mindfulness practice or any sort of self-development work, yoga or otherwise, of the sort that you or any other guest here might be talking about. What if you realize that the path that you're on isn't right for you? Let's say you do that ayahuasca ceremony and you come out of it, and during integration realize that your body, your mind, or the spirit, if that's what you believe that's driving this, tells you your 30 years of work in the corporate sector, in my case, it might have been as a lawyer. In your case, it might have been as a teacher, or it might be as an engineer or architect, that's wrong. And then you're faced with the choice, and perhaps even a compelling desire, to make a shift after you've invested your whole life and your finances and your family, your family expectations on this. Is this sort of self-knowledge something that a leader really would want? Couldn't one argue that it's better to just be blissfully ignorant, to be playing the part of a leader and maintain a status quo, particularly if that status quo is financially lucrative, then go into this self-knowledge, tap into this creativity, and begin to go down professional and life rabbit holes that may not pay off?
So I think that it's important for people to understand that the ego, which is to say the swarm of thoughts that are mainly self-defining thoughts you have about yourself, is a construct. It's made out of language. It's made very early in your life. in all of our lives because of the absolute single-minded focus on language in our culture, for some good reasons and a lot of nefarious reasons. So we have, and this is the point about the body mind, and what people usually don't realize in this society is that all of these linguistic statements you have about yourself, your career, but even more essential stuff, how I relate to other people, what people think of me, that stuff is all connected with the emotional system. And I'm miming the body. That is feelings which are generally not consciously recognized in the moment, but that provide the sort of matrix of motivation that move us through our lives. So that explains right there a lot of contradictions you see. Like a person who is thriving, succeeding by every one of their own definitions. So you ask a person, what do you want? And you say this person is succeeding with flying colors, and yet they're miserable. And they may not even consciously be aware that they're miserable. You may detect the misery in a facial expression or a postural manifestation or a seizing of the breath. But very often, in my experience, the person is aware of this. And it starts to throw up, particularly at a certain point in their life, 50s or 60s. Sometimes my clients generally are in that demographic because they're people that suddenly the paradox is slamming them in the face. Yeah. Of like, I went after the things that I should have gone after because of my talents and because of the values of this society. And I accumulated everything that I was supposed to accumulate. I didn't succeed in every single way, but in the overarching way, I'm a leader. I run this thing, I do this, and I do it very well. And yet there is something drastic that is wrong. So ultimately, and that's how I see it. I look at the ego construct as almost a parasitic mechanism, almost something that is designed out of language. A virus would be another metaphor, but that latches onto us or within us very, very, very young. And for most of our lives, we live as if it is us. So you could almost look at the goal of yoga as to show you what you really are. And that is to say, you're embodied, you have feelings and constant movement of energy inside your physical body. You are a breath that in many languages is the same word as soul and life force. So you are this energy, and you also are a mind, which is to say not simply the stuff that is in the mind or is witnessed by the mind as all these sentences constantly going on in obsessive thought patterns, but actually this kind of mysterious awareness. Ultimately, a person, the ego could be talking and say, after, let's say, 3 sessions of psychedelic yoga, let's say you did 3 to all of your excellent caveats about psychedelic work. You're very careful, you're intentional, you do these 3 trips, and you find that you feel a greater sense of peace and flow inside your incarnate being, but you are suddenly finding it difficult to understand what your career is, or you're having grave misgivings about some big corporate thing you're about to undertake. That's definitely a possibility because your ego has been running the ship. Your ego has created all this stuff, and you more or less feel like you have created that. But probably if you examine it, you realize that most of those structures were given to you by family and culture, society, your life experiences as you were growing up, and what you're really seeking in a way is freedom.
You said something a minute ago that I have to go back to, because I'm hearing what you said as actually bordering on the radical. Certainly, it's dramatic. It's something said with the impact that the muses would have had if they were standing up on a stage. And that is the description of the ego as a parasite.
Yeah. Yeah.
Think about that. How many people become leaders, and they might even acknowledge it, because of ego? Are you saying that there are leaders out there right now that we have who are only in that position because of essentially a mental or spiritual parasitic infection? And if so, think about ego-driven leaders. Think about how many, in politics in particular, it is obvious, but even in even in entrepreneurship, like particularly high level, like tech entrepreneurship or science-based entrepreneurship, or in big business, people know that they've got a big ego. They put themselves out there and in these positions because they want to get rich, or they want to be famous, or they want to be knowledgeable. Are you saying that we are following people without even realizing it, that are essentially dysfunctional because of this parasitism that has infected them? This is a dramatic statement.
It's more dramatic even than that, because most of us are aware. Most of us are aware of this societally. So, for example, the people I work with professionally guiding psychedelic work are often very rich and very accomplished and very unhappy. And we all know people like that. And if you just ask your friends in a social context, let's talk about the happiest, healthiest people we know, and let's talk about the most successful using any of these widely accepted definitions of success, and it'll very soon reveal that those things are not aligned at all. And yet, if you ask someone, what do you really want, and you really want to offer it that way, like Scott, you could do this with a 7-year-old student, but you could say, like, do you want to be happy, or do you want to have enormous accumulation, riches, power, and be unhappy? And most people will actually say, I want to be happy. So they think, the ego construct thinks, and this is obviously what the whole society is built on. So I'm not blaming any individual here. This is mainly the constructs are societal. Is a person thinks, okay, I want to be happy. That's my deepest value. So I need to be successful in order to achieve that. And yet, from the data pool that they have, all the people that they know, that's false. So that is a predicament right there.
Well, it also, though, points as to something that anyone who is in a follower position, which all of us are, I mean, no one is a leader in everything, whether it's following your doctor's advice, right? You're the follower there, and the doctor probably is the leader. Or when it comes to being a political leader, again, even the president of the United States is ultimately subservient to the voters, or at least the interest groups that are putting him or her in power. Right? I mean, when we are selecting who we follow as leaders, thinking about to what extent they are being driven by ego, this is someone who is under the spell of a malign parasitic force. And if you think about it that way, to me at least, what, again, a lot of data points and studies and other knowledge pools have demonstrated, that ego-driven leadership ultimately isn't sustainable. Ego-driven leaders turn against their followers. Ego-driven leaders tend to ultimately bring about a lot of ruin. It might make us better able to see clearly what choices we're making when we select leaders and how we're responding to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think that the ego in this particular day and age, and this is exacerbated by just language and also social media and things like that, but the ego is so over elaborated in this day and age that most people, even just taking a moderate practice to reduce the dominance of the ego, that's what you can look at a yoga practice. And again, I'm not just talking stretchy postures, but all the meditation, everything you're doing, psychedelic ceremony with intention, is to reduce the domination of this construct. It's not to get rid of it. Like for most people, they're not going to go to an ayah ceremony or sit in meditation for half an hour and go and then live in an ashram for the rest of their life. They're going to return to their karmic world and they're going to do the thing. But the ego is so dysfunctional for most people in this society, in this neck of the woods, this particular time, that any measures to reduce the dominance of the ego are going to actually make them more effective in their ego sphere, which is to say their life, their ambition, and so on. And that is a paradox, but it really makes sense. Let me go back to the muses one more time. So
Please.
one of the reasons it's proposed that Zeus, hooks up with the goddess of memory to produce these muses that are then going to ease human suffering through poetry and history and mime and all these other things, is to forget language. Is that the goddess of memory also has the empowerment to cause forgetting. And what is to be forgotten is language and ideas that keep things static and uncreative. So the idea that forgetting is extremely important for this. And one more connection with that, because I couldn't, when I was sort of researching this, and I came up upon this, and I know this from music, in New Guinea, there's a compilation of indigenous tracks, and these are translations, of course, of the indigenous tongue of New Guinea, because these are like wild instruments. There's an instrument where you basically have a stick, and it's held to the mouth. It's like a jaw harp, and you pluck on this string, and then with the shape of your mouth, you sculpt the sound. But the title of the piece is called Music. It again translated, but Music for the Dispel of Thoughts. The purpose of music is to get rid of thoughts. And I thought about that, and I was like, and it's so immediate, because again, this is a culture that is completely has none of the trappings of modernity, none of the modern social media stuff, no machines, nothing, and there's still the sense that humans become bogged down and in pain and crimped by words, by thoughts in the form of language, and that music is this divine means of getting rid of that, so that we can be true, it's truly in ourselves, so we can be happy, so we can flow. So I think that connects very nicely with this idea that the reason that it's Zeus and the goddess of memory is to help us to forget things that don't serve us.
I can't help but think about the octopus. Now, I am not a marine biologist by any stretch of the imagination, nor am I an expert in octopuses or octopi, whatever. And so I will not say what I am about to say as coming from the mouth of someone who has firsthand expertise. It's merely what I've read. But the tragedy of the octopus is that, from what I've read, many of those species have intellect to evolve into something almost like a civilization, but they die almost immediately after birth. After birthing their children. And so they don't have the ability to transmit cultural knowledge to their children. So there's never an accumulation of knowledge, let alone the development of wisdom. And so the poor octopus is stuck at the bottom of the ocean with the intellect, at least in theory, to be able to build something greater, but without the capacity to engage with the goddess of memory. Or one might say they've been cursed by the goddess of memory to constantly forget. Interestingly, though, there was a show called Xena, the Warrior Princess, that was popular on television when I was a young man. I won't say how long ago it was, because I'd be revealing more about myself.
I remember that too, though, Scott. We're contemporaries. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we're both in our early 30s. We're old enough to remember that. And
thank you.
And there was an episode, there was an episode where Xena, the Warrior Princess's little friend, was unhappy with her life and her history, and so she went to this temple, and she was granted the gift of forgetting everything about her life. And so there's this big dramatic scene when the friend leaves this temple, and she's walking in this robotic zombie-like way, and she forgets Xena. Now, I don't remember exactly how this was resolved and how her memory was restored, but it does go as to something that I think about a lot, and then ties into leadership and what you're talking about, at least as I'm hearing, the journey that psychedelic experiences or mindfulness practices or yoga-like practices or yoga itself can take someone on, which is having the foundation of your past upon which to heal. Do you think it would be better if a leader didn't have trauma or distress in their background at all to have to work through? Now, the reason why I ask that is because I've read before, a number of places, that most of the truly great leaders have had to overcome real struggles and trauma in their lives. And that struggle has helped them become the great leader that we all admire and respect, and has a legacy and is positively remembered and has an impact. But if we didn't have trauma at all to work through, if we didn't even need to go through this journey, do you think that leadership might be played out more effectively? And I say that again because to the extent that ego defenses are built up, a lot of times those are related to response to trauma. Give me your thoughts.
That's correct. That's very beautiful. You really asked great questions. We go on and on with this, but yeah. But there's a mundane aspect that, the ego will be constructed. There's nobody that's going to get away with not having an ego in this society. So you're going to get one. It's going to, all these values, and you're going to have all these thought forms that are associated with feeling tones. What I think of as trauma is basically, holding patterns in the chakras or in the body that are painful, that are not really easily connected with thought forms. So you might say, a cognitive behavioral approach where you say, well, I have these unhealthy mentations that are dragging down my confidence, that are making me, function poorly in my work. And all I have to do is, figure out what I'm thinking and reframe it so that I understand it in a more self-supporting way. That will fail if the shitty feeling, because again, we're talking about a mind body. There's no such thing as an ego constructed only of thoughts. It's all the feelings that you have that are constantly in this feedback process. And sometimes you'll investigate and you will not find a very simple adjustment of your thoughts that translates into something energetic. And that's where your karma is. You're going to have to, if you want to, get deeper with your breath, access more of your energy, find more genuine confidence, in that method acting, find a better connection to the character of leader that you're playing in your life. You're going to have to examine get with the physical manifestations of the trauma. And that's where, you have therapeutic modalities. That's where psychedelic work, I think, is very helpful, because it reduces the power of language so much that you then have this often very intimate access to the feelings in the body.
How expansive can human creativity be? How much power can connecting with the muses bring to a leader? And the reason why I'm asking that question before you answer, because I'm going to get there whether you answer it to include this or not, is that, as you mentioned earlier, among the things that you do is teach astronomy and physics. Imagination, creativity, the muses, has taken our species, and some might and have argued that psychedelics, in particular psilocybin, magic mushrooms, have taken us from being ape-like animals on the savannah to creating technology, to building cities and later civilizations, to going to the moon. Perhaps thinking of the muse of astronomy, maybe even one day going to the stars. How far do you think, how far do you think we can go? How do you think that we'll actually get that far to the stars themselves?
Wow, that's a cool question. Yeah, as far as sort of the innate creative capacities of the human, the best you can do is take this, which is pretty darn good, is to take those innate capacities and allow them some freedom. And that, for most of us as grown-ups approaching the question of how do we maximize our creative flow, is a question of how do we, least problematically, most safely return to a more childlike state of interacting with the world. Probably in circumscribed things like psychedelic ceremony or healing practices with, as you were saying, that are supervised in the right way. Because it's going to be impractical to show up at your next board meeting with your child's mind fully. Even crossing the street. This is the example. It's like crossing the street. The toddler has someone holding their hand, because the point is they're not like like awestruck by, oh my God, the moon, oh my God, those patterns of the trees. But really that state of being susceptible to awe and wonder at every step, that's the state. That's the creative flow state. And what happens is, by virtue of education, and I'm not saying anything about nefarious, mechanisms in society. There are plenty of those, but just the act of learning makes things more mundane. You say, like, look at the moon, it's round. And you sort of say, okay, the moon is round. And then you add that fact of the roundness of the moon, and you cease to have that immediate direct experience of holy shit. And that's what the toddler has. But again, the toddler needs someone holding their hand to cross the street so they get hit by a car when they're looking at the moon. So and there's an analogy in the functioning of some a corporate leader. So the idea is that this person would be able to free up those energies, have an intimate connection with their own childlike creativity, which is enormous. Like, I do psychedelic work sometimes, Scott, and I have these experiences where I'm just agog at how creative the mind is and how wild the imagination is at my age, as someone who has had a lot of exposure to the arts and things like that, but like just how vast our creative powers are. But when I'm in those psychedelic states, often I don't know that I even have a body, much less specific a to-do list, of things I have to carry out in my adult life. So I would say that optimally, to go back to the astronomer, because I want to get to the question of how far we're going to go out in the stars, and make a metaphor for the individual human, because that ultimately takes a combination of awe and wonder, like Carl Sagan so eloquently expresses in his book on the varieties of scientific experience, and all of the nuts and bolts. We got to grind the equations. We have to know that the rocket boosters are going to function. So a lot of analytical work that you could look at as uncreative, but it has to be kind of harmonized.
Yeah.
So in terms of the question of how far will humans go in exploring the universe, it's like if the approach to it is fundamentally, and this is why I'm saying the hypothetical client of mine, I have actual real clients like this who are like existing in a very high functioning way in the corporate world, and yet they're approaching this thing which is really about intimate knowledge of of what you are, your spirit, your awareness, your energy, and your body, what you are. If that's taken on in earnest, the desire to go out and explore the stars is not going to go away. Maybe better decisions will be made as to what kinds of missions to go on. Like, for an example, NASA could choose to fund a $800 billion put boots on Mars, for example, which is going to be enormously expensive, but has kind of imperial kind of look at what we did, technology. Maybe it'll even be what countries are warring to get the first boots on Mars versus
Ego.
ego, or let's explore Europa and Enceladus, these moons of outer planets that have liquid water and probably harbor some form of life. And those missions might be much, much cheaper, but less egoic. So in a lot of ways, the progress of a person, let me like blink my eyes twice, and I did all this psychedelic work, I did all this excavation, I did all the spiritual work, and 5 years ago I quit my multi-million-dollar job. Or 5 years ago, I made a key decision with how I conduct leadership in that role because of these discoveries about myself, and it failed. Like, it produced in the ego's terms of failure. Or I made this commitment to freeing up my energy and my creativity. I changed into a different type of leader, and now I'm functioning way, way, way better, not only for my own happiness and flow, but also for the what my ego would say are the values. So those things are like hard to predict, because the things are the field of human endeavor is very complex. But I do think that in this particular neck of the woods, the ego is so over elaborated. People are there's so much suffering, even by people who can go to any restaurant they want to for every meal, that it is not only a practical matter, but also deeply spiritual matter to pause the game and return to the body, return to the breath. If I'm looking at the stars and I want to get to the stars, the place to start is by knowing myself.
What a poetic way to end a conversation about the Nine Muses. Henry, if there is one takeaway that has stuck with me so far in this conversation, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more that sticks with me as time goes on and I ponder this, it is that, interestingly enough, by letting go of the ego, by recognizing the ego as, in words that you used and have clearly resonated with me today, as a parasite, you are able to better tap into that creativity, ultimately by acting upon that creative tap in. You may end up being able to better fulfill some of the needs that ego might have had in the first place, as well as become something infinitely greater and infinitely more positively affecting to those you interact with. If there is a final word that you would like to have, or something that you want to share that you haven't had a chance to so far, please do that, Henry. I'd love to hear what it is.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Well, I am very impressed by your approach, and it resonates with this idea of the muses as beings that drive whatever the process is, the creative process, the connection between the creative process and a person's sense of deep peace of mind and the way they act in the world, all those things being connected. And what I really appreciate is this what I look at as just a very skillful. I would almost say that if you and I were given the charge to do what we're doing, try to improve people's lives and try to improve the culture in the ways that we're trying to do it, and all we were given was the science. So we didn't have any mystical traditions, no mythologies, nothing. All we were given is like the cognitive science, the brain scans, that we would probably land. It might take a lot more work, but we'd probably land somewhere similar. We'd say, like, we have deep natural connections with other humans. We have a sense of our own arc through life as wanting to be a story. We have a gift for stories. Like, it's like when they were discovering this, epic poetry is not, it sounds cool. Rhyme, rhyme, rhythm. What are these things?
Yeah.
They're not just cool sounding things. They're things that improve your capacity to remember things. And they're things that arouse your motivation, your sense of connection with the other members of the tribe. So what I love about this, and really appreciate this about this, is the holistic aspect of it. We say to better yourself for your professional function, to better yourself as a parent, or as a person in a relationship, or a member of society, to even just look at your own relationship with your deepest self, and that these things are fundamentally all connected. I really, really appreciate that. So I think what you're doing is very important.
The feeling is very mutual, and you have more than demonstrated that tapping into creativity, bringing together a whole host of disciplines, and then really imagining what it can bring to us as individuals and as collective groups of humans. You've demonstrated that there's just a genuine power and surprising motherload of possibility involved. Henry, how can people find out more about you, and tell us about anything that you have going on that you want to share and that we should know about?
Well, I'm at Henry Kandel, Kandel.com. And that's where my professional services are available, but also lots of writings. There's a blog, lots of stuff on psychedelic yoga. I run a meetup called Psychedelic Yoga, and I run things usually every week, focusing on breathwork, integrated with psychedelics, focusing on lucid dreaming and dream yoga, which is kind of like the original psychedelic yoga and very useful for lots of things, including leadership manifestation, and other kinds of psychedelic practice. I also have a Reddit called Ketamine State Yoga, which focuses on ketamine, but I also run far field in all kinds of different related topics. And I'm working on a book which I would love to have done by the end of the year, but we'll see. Keep an eye out for it. It'll probably be something like a general case for psychedelic yoga. So like what is the role of mind-body practitioners that work yogically with their own minds and bodies to the psychedelic renaissance, to all these different syntheses that, Scott, you're interested in, and hopefully are going to build momentum, make a better world, stuff like that.
And I have no doubt that the work you're doing will build a lot of momentum too. It certainly is in the spirit of the muses. Very
thank you, Scott.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this show, be sure to press the thumbs up button below and then subscribe to this channel. You'll see all of Henry's socials in the captions. Make sure that you connect with him there as well as with mine. And be sure to come back. We look forward to a lot more conversations here at the Myth Slayer Café. We try and keep them real. We try and keep them rich. We try and keep them deep, because above all else, I want your future to be epic.